Right, is the sound okay for everybody on Zoom? Yes. Awesome. Got a yes from Amanda. That's great. Thanks. Right, yeah, it is a pleasure to be here, and I'm still feeling like I don't know this place yet, either the university or the West Coast. So it's been really nice to learn this seascape instead of a landscape. And I'm feeling like I'm being transformed, and I'll talk to you today a little bit about the work that we're doing and how we're trying to change and improve and lead parks to be effective and equitable and to respond to the times that we're in. First, though, who am I? Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Claire. That was great. And just a couple of things of setting up where I come from to get into this work. So I started my academic work in inclusion action research. So working with communities with disabilities, with their caregivers, to try and see how they can engage in parks and wilderness experiences really on both sides of the counter, is how we say it, not just as visitors, but to help manage park systems, to help engage in research, to help do all the things that parks offer in terms of experiences and learning, and of course, conservation values. So most of my career looked like that. I still miss wearing a uniform. You never have to decide what to wear in the morning. Of course, with COVID, that's true now too. My graduate work was in interdisciplinary studies. I looked at the effects of different places on people's well-being, their stewardship values, and actually had the privilege to work with the IRES to take people to a sacred site and to see the differences when they knew they were in a place that held cultural value and stories and how that impacted their experience. And Indigenous-led cultural monitoring. So this is work I will not take credit for. This is work I'm just helping facilitate. So there's Indigenous-led cultural monitoring, in particular of the bison reintroduction in Banff National Park, as well as other species at risk. And then the work with CPCIL, the Canadian Parks Collective for Innovation and Leadership, is a ton of fun. Generally, we travel around to different parts of Canada and get to look at problem-based learning and work with communities to see what we can do by bringing park leaders together. Of course, we can't do that now. We still aim for a transformational experience where people get a chance to look at things from new perspectives, get unsettled a little bit on some of their patterns, and see ways forward as park leaders. What is CPCIL? Well, it's a collaboration. It's a collaboration that was started by the Canadian Parks Council, and that itself is a collaboration. It's a network of all of the federal, provincial, and territorial park agencies. They've worked together since 1962. To come up with common solutions for mutual problems. One of those has been staff development and training, and it's evolved from operational, how do you run a park, to more transformational leadership. How do you create leaders in a park system? How do you respond to complex times? But what was unique with the Canadian Parks Collective is with the founding schools of Mount Royal University, Royal Roads, York's Faculty of Urban and Environmental Change, and University of Moncton, we proposed a network that expanded beyond park agencies to bring in academic partners and people working in parks and protected areas. It's expanded since then. University of Guelph, University of Alberta, Wilfrid Laurier should be on there, and my apologies if they're watching, and the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. And now UBC. And it's a pleasure to be here at IRES and to bring this conversation into what is quite an amazing group of people. So the C in CPCIL is for Canadian, seems to make sense. But when we talk about that, first of all, we're not talking about borders. We're talking about the land mass. We're talking about Turtle Island, talking about this large interconnected system. And the agencies that are in the Canadian Parks Council are responsible for 2 million square kilometers of protected lands and freshwaters in 2,700 parks. The P for parks is more than just those formal protected areas, though. We really talk about protected areas, private land conservation, OECMs, community and conserved areas, and Indigenous protected and conserved areas as part of this continuum of parks and protected areas that a colleague, Bruce Downey from Yukon, said parks are wherever we learn to love life. If you can connect with biodiversity, you could probably call that a park. The collective is the idea that we work together. We can all be stronger. A rising tide lifts all ships. And if we work together, we find that a lot of the things that we're tackling are the same problems. We just call them different things. So how can we reframe them and see the links between all of our work? And then leadership. The focus is on mid-career park managers, but it's extended to people in an academic setting who have an interest in parks and protected areas, who are teaching, researching, working in that space. And moving beyond management, where management, as Drucker says, is doing things right, but leadership is doing the right things. The I, I'll spend some time with, though, it's for innovation. At least that's where it started. The idea of looking at parks differently, innovating with new approaches, innovating by shifting our perspective, like that's somebody who has a disability and they're mountain biking. Creating new technologies and new approaches to connecting people with nature. The I really can stand for interdisciplinary, indigenization, integration, impact, integrity, involvement, inclusion, or it can just be the feather. And the reason we chose the feather as we developed, we were looking at the kinds of things that CPCIL should focus on in our programs and decided the feather worked really well as a metaphor. The quill is for conservation. It holds the feather to the bird, and conservation holds parks and protected areas together. If we don't conserve biodiversity, then there's nothing to hold parks and protected areas to their core, to their root, to what they're here for. But you also need to have the central shaft to connect people. And that's where parks particularly are a little different than some protected areas. They have a mandate to connect people with nature, to connect people with biodiversity. The downy region, the soft part of the feather, is good management. Good, effective management, like understanding how to work with tourism operators, understanding fiscal sustainability of a park agency. Those are the things that insulate a park and insulate biodiversity just like they insulate the bird. And then the stiff veins are leadership. That area that links together and creates a wing is where parks and protected areas can take flight, where they can really start to have a purpose moving forward to do things that are good for biodiversity, for connection, for reconciliation, which is the part that isn't on the feather. And reconciliation overarches everything the Canadian Parks Council is trying to do and see how parks can come to terms with their dark past and with the wrongs that have been done historically in many parks and protected areas, and try and move forward with Indigenous leaders in conservation. What does the CPCIL do with this? We say we reveal, connect, and transform an inclusive pan-Canadian community of parks and protected areas leaders, academics, and knowledge holders. And the revealing part is really important. There are lots of informal relationships, a lot of great things happening at a watershed level, a lot of relationships that have continued, but they don't have structures to carry them forward and support them. So we're trying to build the social capital to support those relationships, make connections, and then help people see ways to do things differently. Started with me as a senior fellow, park agency collaborators, our academic collaborators, some student assistants, and there were 240 park leadership alumni just 3 years ago from that earlier system of park leadership programs. And now it's growing, as Jillian and Sabrina know, to have lots of student assistants, to have contract knowledge gatherers. We have a doctoral student at York University working with us on knowledge mobilization, as well as practitioners who are staying involved even after they've completed programs. Right now, we're running currently, 20 minutes ago, running a program that's an e-residency for some of these park leaders focused on parkonomics right now. So what are the economic things people should think about in managing a sustainable park system, nested within those other aspects of leadership and management and conservation and connection? We also have a leadership accelerator where people are bringing specific problems that we will help them find resources and tools to try and address those issues. We've talked about bringing some of those questions, those wicked problems to classes, to researchers to say, hey, can we look at this together? And then primers, like a park primer we're just launching on parks representation and Black history, created by Jacqueline Scott. collaborative leadership for innovation created by Sylvie Plant, and research and knowledge for new park decision makers created by Charlotte Gorley at Royal Roads. And then there's a platform that has webinars. We have regional networking calls every month to get people, whether they're academics or practitioners, to be able to connect with each other. Community of practice check-ins. We just had one this week with 50 people, and it was a community of practice on inclusion, another on tourism in parks, and a third on conservation mental health. And then a virtual summit that will be held February 22nd to 25th in 2022, and also collaborative research that was mentioned. So it's been 3 years since CPCIL launched, and we've had over 100 people come through the leadership program. Others have participated online and at events and at the summit. And what we're noticing are a few things. First of all, there are lots of problems, a lot of opportunities that are complicated, and a lot of them are shared across jurisdictions. In Connecting as Nature Through Parks last fall, people were interested in ethical space, in how do you connect kids to nature in parks. A lot of parks didn't see connections to child and nature movement and other pieces of that conversation. So lots of interest of how do you communicate climate change throughout an agency so people see it as everybody's business, not just the conservation and resource management specialists. The role of parks during COVID. Should parks and protected areas, or parks in particular, be considered essential services? They certainly had high demand, but they weren't necessarily prepared for the amount of demand and the kind of behaviors that we're seeing. And the one in the winter focused on leadership in climate change in parks. And again, focus on Indigenous relationships. One team worked on a primer on ethical space for park leaders. Another on how can you find pathways into talking about cultural relations in parks, especially if you're somebody with lots of experience who hasn't necessarily had exposure or an opportunity to work directly with First Nations. Decision-making tools, could you apply things like the resist, accept, and direct RAD framework to other areas of park operations? And youth engagement and retention. How do you ensure that the workforce in parks and protected areas represents the people who care about biodiversity and connection? Kinds of themes we're seeing. There's quite a lot of interest. People want to know about connecting people and conservation, but reconciliation is a really important part. These are reflective of the kinds of problems and challenges park leaders bring to these programs. This is what they want to have help sorting out. Same with the capstone projects. Lots of focus on connecting people. How do we reach communities and partners? And some highlights for you, opportunities potentially to get involved in CPCIL. You can join a community of practice. You can start a community of practice. You can turn a wicked problem from a park leader into wicked research and help them solve a problem through research. Ontario Parks are looking at conservation mental health right now, and we just did a pilot by bringing in a challenge coin to reduce stigma about mental health and just understand how people on the front lines of climate change and biodiversity loss are coping. Helping develop workshops and create content, or even just share content that's out there. And sharing and collaboration opportunities, or bringing these capstone projects, these issues, these wicked problems to your class, or consider them in your own research. During COVID, we had the amazing opportunity to grow. Because we were already working in an online virtual network space, CPCIL was well suited to continue making the kinds of connections people were starting to crave. And with great support from Parks Canada and their knowledge mobilization unit, we were able to start work on a pan-Canadian Parks and Protected Areas research network. So this is a network that's designed to find pathways for researchers, students, knowledge holders, community partners, and park agencies to connect, to find common questions, to find issues they can work together on. There's a platform that's available for people to join to identify whether you're a researcher or a practitioner or both, like me, where you can be profiled as a leader. You can join a community of practice, share resources. We're encouraging people to submit blog posts, post jobs and opportunities, have an events calendar, and we're trying to build a crowdsourcing tool so people can crowdsource research or crowdsource projects. Say, hey, I've got this place. I'm looking for somebody who'd like to study this issue at this place. or I have this funding. I'd like to have a place to use it, to do a good research project that's applied and on the ground. And if you log in, there's a dashboard where you can access forums and groups, connect with people within that space. It's a private social network. Essentially, it's like Facebook, but not creepy. So how might we work together to improve parks and protected areas research, knowledge mobilization, and the development of advice for evidence-based decision-making? That's the mandate of the Parks and Protected Areas Research Network nested within CPCIL. That's what we're working with Parks Canada on. And the themes we're seeing along this and where people have been wanting to focus in our webinars, there's again, lots of interest in conservation and connection, as well as in leadership. How do we support effective leadership, effective organizations? The Research Summit last year, we piloted, it was about half conservation focused, and then connection, management, reconciliation, and leadership. We are trying to push to an interdisciplinary summit and make sure that it's broadly representative of social science, interdisciplinary studies, and still the conservation issues that are so important to parks and protected areas. And as was mentioned, we were involved in a number of research projects. What's become really a great opportunity is when large collaborations begin, there's often no way to connect with the parks community in general. Either you have to have a relationship with a director at an agency or somebody who's a representative, but through CPCIL, different projects have been able to connect so that practitioners can get involved in some of these large studies. And so we've been able to advocate to say, hey, work with this person at Manitoba Parks or make an introduction here or there. And there's a number of these projects that have gone forward this past year that we've been able to be involved in and provide feedback and get input from practitioners. A couple that I'll highlight: parks and knowledge mobilization. How does natural science, social science, Indigenous and local knowledge inform decisions in parks? And there's a series of case studies. We were able to connect researchers directly with practitioners so that there wasn't that gap that sometimes occurs where you feel like the researchers and the practitioners don't get a chance to work together until the research is done or it's too late to influence a problem. Nature for All, happening here in BC on accessibility and inclusion in outdoor recreation and nature-based tourism. And the idea there is to build accessibility tools that can be spread in a pan-Canadian way. And then the Pacific Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas Knowledge Hub. This is an initiative of Isak Olem Foundation and the Canadian Mountain Network, Network of Centers of Excellence that we're a part of to help connect, again, people on the ground in parks and protected areas with the great leadership being shown in Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And then we see potential for more research, for things that we think this network, this community and collective can facilitate, that can answer or at least start to address some things that are arising as some of those challenges they keep coming up, like equity, diversity, and inclusion within parks and protected areas agencies, not just the people who come to parks and visit them. Others like trying to understand the narratives of conservation leadership in Canada from Pathway to Target 1 to the 30 by 30 targets. And how do those narratives change now that we have more IPCAs, that we want to look at decolonizing parks, that we want to look at other effective and conserved means, conservation methods, pardon me. Looking at organizational tensions about financing conservation. When somebody comes up through parks, as I did for most of my career, I didn't come in with a finance background or even an accounting background, yet was put into a place to make decisions that made our financial sustainability succeed or fail. And others have had that same experience. How do we solve some of those tensions and make sure that parks are set up for success? Mapping the Parks and Protected Areas Collective. Who are the players in conservation? Are there unseen networks, unseen players? And then reconciliation in existing parks. Applying lessons from IPCAs and the transformative change required in both the agencies and the people themselves. Because there are big changes coming to reconcile with, for example, the past history of wrongdoings that are reflected in some parks. But some highlights and opportunities here. Again, join the platform at CPCIL.ca. We'd like to see people start talking to each other, building up through conversation. The Pan-Canadian Parks and Protected Areas Research Virtual Summit in February will be opening a call for submissions in the coming month. Just finalizing our selection committee right now. And if you're interested in being part of the selection committee, contact me. And then support our youth knowledge gatherers. We've just started bringing on some youth from different backgrounds to help us tease away at and look at the stories around parks and what hidden narratives are there, what stories are being elevated and what ones are being missed. And we're working with them over the next year, again, with support from Parks Canada, start looking at equity and diversity in parks and to create some workshops and tools to help park agencies reflect and consider systemic barriers that they might be perpetuating or have an opportunity to start solving. And then conservation through reconciliation partnership. I mentioned it earlier. It's a large partnership, multiple years up, I think year 3 of 7 right now, working to implement the recommendations of the Indigenous Circle of Experts report, We Rise Together. CPCIL is involved, and I have the privilege to be involved in some of their committees and streams like the Ethical Space Stream and the Knowledge Mobilization Working Group. And just to say, how do we take that Indigenous leadership that's being seen in Canada and demonstrated and translate it out to people so more are able to connect with some of these great approaches to conservation. So hopefully that's enough opportunities to get you excited. Hopefully people can see some links, or if you can think of some links, I do encourage people to reach out. We want this to be an evolving collective that can grow with the needs of people interested in effective and equitable parks and protected areas. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that, what you're doing with CPCIL. And I think that does give people an idea of what you're doing and how they can plug in, which I think was was your goal. Typically, we have questions from students first. So I wonder if there are any questions in the audience or in the chat from students. About, yes.
Not me directly at the level of working with a nation that's cross-boundary, but there certainly is work across Canada, and there's leadership that is reflected by people who are themselves identifying as First Nation who cross boundaries, some of the leadership we see in the IPCAs. The National Association of State Parks Directors is a member of the Canadian Parks Council, and they've been bringing a lot of their conversation to that space, which has been great. And then researchers, Chance Finnegan from York was one of the individuals that helped develop CPCIL as we put the proposal together, and he did work on some of the First Nations collaborations in the States, and it was great to bring that lens to this too. Yeah.
Yes.
I was wondering when you mentioned framework or what's called that sounds interesting.
Sure. So yeah, for the Zoom. Yeah. So the question was about the RAD framework. So resist, accept, direct. And I am not an expert in it. It was a team, a capstone team that was so park leaders from different agencies who took one of the programs, wanted to say, they all get tasked to do a project to improve park leadership or to contribute to park leadership. And they wanted to take this model of climate change adaptation that was developed in the States, the National Park Service, I think, is who developed it, but resist, adapt, and direct. And so sort of how do you adapt your planning when you know that some things can't be stopped, some of these changes coming. And so this framework is used to figure out priorities, to figure out how to move forward. I'm certain there's people here who know more about it than I do. And, you know, Simon Donner, I'm sure, would know. I don't know if he's here, but yeah. Yeah. But they did post, I'm going to shamelessly plug, that group's project is posted on the website. So you can have a look and see what they've said about it.
Yeah. We have the same question that she'd like she's wondering if she could be updated.
This is for Anna? Okay. Oh, okay. Go ahead and see if you can unmute.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Do you hear out there?
Yep.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just had a question in regards to that kind of knowledge mobilization component and the research that you guys do. As an Indigenous person, my research typically hits this kind of middle ground complication when I do work with like say City of Vancouver Parks Board or et cetera in regards to knowledge mobilization. There's like a huge polarization. Myself as an Indigenous person, I have certain arguments around how certain knowledges should be shared and how sometimes they're sacred and shouldn't be shared with non-Indigenous communities. However, on the flip side, there's a lot of Indigenous communities and people who argue that our knowledge, when shared by Indigenous people, should be kind of spread out to the masses. So kind of a big question, but I was just kind of curious around, I guess, stance / where the research and where all these collaborations are kind of coming to a conclusion around how knowledge mobilization should occur and how it's done in a way that does protect Indigenous knowledge. And if that's a huge question, let me know. It's something I just grapple with in regards to protecting knowledge for generational histories, but also wanting knowledge mobilization for environmental stewardship and for collaboration as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And everybody heard it in here? So both CPCIL and the Canadian Parks Council, so who really directs what we're doing and what we want to bring to the park leaders, as well as a lot of the partners we're working with, and I'll particularly point out the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership and Parks Canada are working with that same question and trying to grapple with it. And in terms of the network that we're trying to build it with Indigenous guidance and saying, how can we shape this? And if we haven't finished shaping it, how can we at least move towards a better place where there's space for Indigenous knowledge to be shared the way those knowledge holders want to share it? We're also taking a lot of guidance from the Elder Circle and the Elders Lodge of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, who talk a lot about ethical space and this idea that you have knowledge systems that can exist parallel, they can inform decisions, and there's multiple knowledge systems, and trying to create an ethical space between them is like creating an interface where it's not about changing one system or another or trying to impose the values of one system on another, but rather creating an interface to make communication and decision-making possible. So that's the piece that I find the most exciting and the most fruitful for things like managing biodiversity, working with access to land and equity, is finding that ethical space first. And that's still a big question, is how do you get there and understand it? So I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, it definitely feels like the time where everyone's grappling with that now that we're kind of in a space where appropriate forms of collaboration are occurring. There's this Indigenous scholar called Kyle White, and he talks about as long as it's being done in the way that you're saying it's being done, and we avoid the supplemental value around knowledge mobilization. So like it's this like additional knowledge, which is like what you spoke of, then you're kind of on the right track. So that reminds me of what you said. And thank you for that answer. That was great.
Thanks.
Are there questions out there? I think the floor is open for questions from anyone. Yes.
I was curious about the sort of approaches for how you framed a proposal and get that sort of off the ground.
So the example, the BC one, you mean the Nature for All, the accessibility one? Yeah, so it's a great example where, again, we're not, and I won't take credit for it, we just are happy to be part of a group that can facilitate some conversation and connections. Mark Rule at University of Northern British Columbia and the Spinal Cord Injury Prevention Society of BC, I may have that wrong and apologies. They've been working together for years, and BC Parks has an accessibility guarantee, like they're trying to be more accessible and inclusive. And they're actually a really good example of where practitioners were working with some academics and then working with some partners and then started to say, hey, maybe we can make a more robust effort here that involves examining the literature that's out there, looking at other approaches, doing some really good evaluation of what's happening. And in this case, we're helping, and part of this is my own interest and my own research background is how do we move something like that, which is on accessibility and making experiences accessible, and have a conversation about inclusion as well, and getting accessibility beyond just a visit, but decision makers and sort of transforming that group. So a good example, because it's showing how the conversations are shaping some of the work on the ground to say, can we be informed by evidence and research? Are there some methods that help us know what we're doing? And then the other way around, some researchers saying, hey, I'm really interested in this, but let's make it really practical. Let's do something that's, got some application right away, so we can start seeing how to learn from the action that we're taking. Does that help?
Other questions about that? Yeah. From the outside Toronto, I think that would be for out there.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question for Zoom is, as somebody, and pardon me, I didn't repeat the previous question, but this one is about somebody from downtown Toronto, somebody in an urban setting feeling disconnected from conservation. And does that come up in this work? It absolutely does. Parks Canada is just announced a national urban park strategy. A lot of parks and protected areas systems have urban parks, and I managed two when I was in Alberta, Fish Creek and Glenbow Ranch. And there, there's a difference. Maybe I'll tease out a little bit. There's incredible work being done by municipally run parks, like City of Calgary, and Park People does great. And that's a great place to start to connect with conservation in an urban setting. We're working with some of these agencies that are focusing on urban parks that maybe are thinking of them from a conservation point of view, or thinking of them more akin to like a larger connected landscape. So again, not trying to speak ill of the municipal parks, more than I'm not trying to speak for them. So who we've been working with, like Parks Canada, see those urban parks as a tremendous opportunity to connect people to conservation. And what's exciting in urban parks is there's both the connection to the broader system and the broader conversation about biodiversity and connecting people to these great wild spaces, but it's such a great opportunity to connect people to nature in the backyard, to local connections, to really intimate relationships with, trees you can watch grow through the seasons and things like that. So there's quite a lot of interest in urban parks. And I think even more so just that sense of how do you get people to live mindfully in nature? And wherever you are, nature is there too. And these urban parks become a great place to start to tease that out and teach about it and connect people with it. Does that help?
I'll maybe ask a question of you that I was curious about. Since CPCIL is such a new organization, really only going back 3 years, I'm wondering if you thought about this from the beginning, or if you are starting to think about how do you sort of assess the impact of CPCIL? And then I was thinking, well, the impact on what? Because there's so many different objectives and ways that you're, trying to make improvements, whether it's, on conservation or on reconciliation or many other aspects. So I was wondering, you're definitely tracking quite a few indicators about, the kinds of themes that are coming up and that sort of thing. Is that part of a monitoring system, or can you speak to sort of assessing the impact of CPCIL?
Excellent. And the question for people in Zoom, if they didn't hear it, was how are we thinking of assessing the impact of CPCIL, of this type of a collective, on park leadership and effective park management? It has, and it's not just from the beginning. It even came from earlier iterations of this leadership program, where the Canadian Parks Council wanted to see if they were seeing impact for the work they were doing. So there's been working groups that have done evaluations, that have done post-program interviews, talking to people about how it's changed their perspective. In this case, because we were purposely building social capital, we're purposely building structures to connect people, we're purposely trying to create some shared understanding, and definitely supporting the relationships among park leaderships across jurisdictions. That's really what I want to measure, is what happens there. Do we see more people in decision-making roles feel comfortable picking up the phone and talking to somebody from another jurisdiction, or reaching out to the academic community and saying, hey, I don't feel like I have to try and solve this problem by myself now. Or as they run into these really tricky problems, saying, I feel like there's a community I can talk to, as opposed to feeling like I just have to be heads down, stuck in this work. So that's the kind of thing that's really interesting to me to measure, is the impact on the community, the collective being created, and that we can measure through engagement in some of the tools and some of the webinars and some of the things that we're creating. And then long term, I think it's still going back to some of those same metrics. What are we seeing changing? Are people using a different lens when they think about challenges and issues related to conservation?
Okay, thank you. Other questions out there? Yeah.
Sure. Okay, I'll change gears here for a second. So the question for Zoom was just if I could expand a little bit on some of the other research that I've been involved in. And yeah, so like, as I said, I really started my graduate studies and my scholarly path looking at inclusion for persons with disabilities, which came from community interest. Where the park I worked in had an accessible facility, William Watson Lodge. So a number of people with different abilities would end up coming to the park, and just through connection, it became really clear that there was a separation, there were barriers, there was exclusions, and they didn't all have the same opportunities to connect in parks. And even then they had more than a lot of others. So with the Premier's Council on the Status of Persons with Disabilities, we did a research project that started trying to understand how people wanted to connect with nature, turn that into an inclusion plan. We worked through a number of iterations where it started to expand to things like inclusion of newcomers, people new to the community, inclusion of youth, and really start to come up with some principles that could be turned into practice or policy for the agency, like increasing access and then inviting participation and then building capacity through collaboration. And that research is sort of still going, it's growing. We did a follow-up with Canadian Mental Health on the mental health impacts of inclusive outdoor recreation on persons with disabilities and their caregivers, which was a really great extension to see it as a community effort, a belonging effort, that not just the person in a wheelchair was affected by inclusive recreation. And then that extended into looking at the effect of nature experience on persons at end of life. So working with a colleague, Sonia Jakovic at Mount Royal, saying when somebody's at end of life, when they're sort of trying to make those meaningful, hopeful connections, and they've had a lifetime of connection to nature, can they still have that connection? How do they feel about it? What do they want out of those final years? And it's a big part of a lot of parks programming. I mean, you see memorial benches, you see people wanting to make those connections to nature. And so we've been continuing that work as well. And again, leading it to application, things like grief walk programs in parks and helping practitioners create programs that are informed about what people are looking for those end of life experiences. And I think that's one that it's been busy, but it would be nice to carry on and continue those conversations of then how do caregivers continue to connect with nature after somebody's passed on? How do you continue to have these conversations of the role of those places that have become special to them and sacred to them? So that's some of my favorite work still. It's just, and it's a really good example too, when I talk about action research and participant action research, is it's sort of feels like a commitment that we're still trying to live up to, is continuing to make things better for the communities that we said we'd work with. And then I guess I'm going to talk not much about my own doctoral work because I'm still wrestling with the next steps on it. But I'm going to talk about the Indigenous-led cultural monitoring, because I think that's really important work too, which is along the lines of, I think it was Atlanta's question, but this sense of how do you start to bring cultural knowledge, traditional knowledge into decisions? And this again is a project where the Stoney Nakoda led a conversation saying, we would like to help inform decisions about species at risk. It started with a grizzly bear study, and I was approached in my previous role of, hey, can we help support a study on grizzly bears and do cultural monitoring? What are indicators from a cultural point of view? And it took 6 years just to get it started, just to find the funding. And then the report was created by elders, by the Stoney Nakoda community, and presented to the park agencies in that area. And even then, there is still a lot of barriers to how do you implement those recommendations? How do you mesh it with the dominant ecological decision making? And the bison study is similar. Tremendous support from Parks Canada, tremendous energy from the Stoney Nakoda research team who've been going into the backcountry and connecting with the bison landscape, seeing the effect on the landscape in the Panther Valley. But the question is, how do you integrate that? How do you bring it back? Integrate isn't the right word. How do you bring it into a space where that knowledge can be used to evaluate the success of reintroducing bison into Banff? I mean, an ecological impact assessment was done, and it didn't say much about cultural values other than there were some cultural values and there was some archaeological history. But from the Stoney Nakoda point of view, they're seeing much more things like impact on medicines and impact on connection to the landscape. So those I wanted to bring up because it also leads to the research that I've been working on as part of a team led by University of Alberta on knowledge mobilization in parks. And what are the barriers to using social science, Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and natural science in decision-making, and really trying to understand what barriers have been coming up, what successes have been existing, what pathways there are to look at decision-making and say, are there ways to be more effective? Are there ways to respect and consider knowledges that are currently intentionally or unintentionally not being used? Some work's been published and when this recording gets shared, I can share links to some of the articles that have been published on it to really start to see some of the trends of where, institutional capacity means people don't have time to even consider other types of research, or the decision needs to be made so quickly, there's no time to even look at research, let alone start new projects. And in some cases that there are barriers, systemic barriers, and even racism, saying people sometimes don't consider other points of view because they just don't believe it. So there's a whole spectrum of things happening in decision-making. And that again is a body of work that I think will continue to grow. And it's exciting to see it grow because it's asking some really good and important questions, and ones that are applicable beyond parks. It's nice here. And, I say parks a lot in my life, but really I like that parks can represent a whole interdisciplinary way of thinking about people's connection to the natural world and biodiversity conservation and connection to nature. Like they're a really nice lightning rod for a lot of those broader conversations. And both the inclusion work and the knowledge mobilization and the work being led by the Stoney Nakoda that I'm part of, working with them, feel like work that has application really far. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there. Is that helpful? Okay, thanks.
You might have brought up some additional questions, and we still have some time. So, yeah.
Okay, so go ahead and answer. Pardon, I don't know the name. Madison, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much, Don. This is fascinating, and I'm really excited about the network that you've been putting together. Very eager to go look on the website and explore a bit more. Your last response kind of alluded to some things I was thinking about, and I'm curious to hear your kind of perspective on how to move forward when you realize that kind of creating ethical space and developing projects that are collaborative and working in a really kind of deeply multiple evidence-based manner requires a lot of time. And yet you confront challenges that need immediate solutions, that need where there is a kind of inertia in the management process where you need to make a decision about next year, you need to make a decision about this year. And there are real consequences to not taking actions quickly. And I'm curious to hear from your own experience and from kind of learning within this collaboration network, how do you balance these things, or how do you how do you foster ethical collaborative space that's built on good trust and also work efficiently? Where are maybe pathways for efficiencies in this process?
Great question. It's a huge question. In fact, I literally came from the park leadership program that we're running this week and next week to this presentation. And that's what we're tackling, is this sense of how do you do this right? How do you do the right thing when it's so complex and there's so many pressures? And we start with empathy and we start with patience. You can't rush trust. And there's a lot of trust to rebuild. There's a lot of personal transformation and reflection required to do the right thing when it comes to especially decisions that require ethical space and require working with cultures that aren't your own. And it even starts with your own cultural assumptions and tackling those. Like, there's a real sense of work in conservation starts with work on yourself. And why are you there? And, you know, why do you want to rush? Why are those efficiencies important? Not to criticize those efficiencies, because I've been there. I mean, 27 years in a park system, you see the importance of taking advantage of opportunities when they come up, saying, hey, look, we can't necessarily do this perfectly, but if we take this step, can we set the stage for the right decision later? And it's sort of the approach is doing the best you can with what you have. But again, starting from a place of empathy, of making sure you're reflective of why you're doing it, and making sure you're not making things worse. I always hear my dad's voice, and have for my whole life, which is, if you're in a hole, stop digging. You know, don't do work that makes things worse. But if there's a chance to hit a status quo and then start to turn the tide, that's the kind of focus we look at with our park leaders, and they're incredible. I mean, the beauty I have, and I love the workshops we get to run, because everybody wants to be there. These park leaders in the main program we run are nominated by their agencies. They're already exceptional leaders. And just over the last 2 days, we've heard people talk about exactly what your question is. And I'll share what we've really started to pick out of their experience, which is start building the relationships first. And then when the issue comes up, you have relationships to build on. And issues will come up, and you may not be able to do the best, but you can do the best you can. But if you slowly work towards the relational piece of co-management, the relational piece of ethical space, then you're better suited when things start to hit the fan. And it gives you permission, and I know for me, it gave me permission to actually breathe and go, yeah, I'm a human, and I have a human lifetime, and these decisions are long decisions, and the impacts and, you know, can be bad quickly, but you can't rush it anyways. Like, you can't change the way time works. So it almost gives you permission to say, okay, well, I'll do the best. And if it takes a whole career, I mean, Bill Snow and I working on the bison side, it's been 12 years and we're still trying to get started. Like, that's the kind of time scale some of these relationships take, but that's the kind of time scale it takes to do it right. And we've had a long time to do it wrong. So I don't know if that helps. I kind of went off the cuff there and got a little musy, but
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's a big question.
yeah.
We probably have time for one or two more questions, if there are any more questions surfacing out there or in there. Okay, well, maybe we will. Oh, there. Okay.
Okay.
I'm curious if you could talk about all these park leaders are thinking about the 30 by 30.
Yeah. Okay. So the question for people on Zoom is how I think the park leaders are thinking about the 30 by 30 target. So even in light of my previous question, I won't speak for them. I can't say how they're feeling about it. Having been close enough to the pathway target, I wasn't involved in the pathway target, but our work is informed by the pathway process and the first set of targets. To me, there was some incredible work in relationship building, just like the last question. And that was where the targets almost became less important to me, and I think to some park leaders, than the intent behind it and the learning how to work better together. And I think 30 to 30, I would hope, is an opportunity to create more opportunities to build those kinds of relationships where it's not about the target, it's about how do we work better together? How do we learn from indigenous practices? How do we learn from good conservation practices so that any land that's counted towards the target is effectively managed? And I will say that's the one thing that the park leaders, and we talk about it, and we actually try and focus some of the workshopping on it, is the difference between, you know, a line on a map and a line on the map that's managed properly. And that's kind of where I think I'm hearing people talk right now. I mean, again, I'm removed from it and I won't speak for any of the participants, but it's sort of this sense that anytime we're talking about conservation, it's an opportunity to have a really good conversation to learn from each other. And I would hope that's what people are seeing. Everything else, I think, is kind of after that. Yeah. Does that help?
Okay, well, that seems like a great place to end it. And just want to thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. Again, that Don is around on Fridays, I believe.
Yeah. And I can come on other days too. That's
Yeah.
I'm predictably here on Fridays.
Predictably here on Fridays, and of course, you're now. So
Yeah.
do reach out and